Hey, what's going on, everyone? Good afternoon, evening, whenever and wherever you are, my friends. My name is Alex, and we are diving into getting started with GDevelop 5. How you doing, folks? All right. So give me just a moment here while I finish getting set up. I had joined a conversation on Discord and hadn't expected it to be as long or engaging as it is. Um, and it is pertinent to the information that I want to give you guys today. So give me half a second to finish this. I'm signing off, and I'll be right here. Yo, what's going on, Rami? Okay, I'm back. All right. So, oh, very nice. Working on some 3D models for Neon Blitz. I saw some of those updates. They're looking stellar, my friend. Really looking forward to that. For those that don't know, you guys should definitely. I have no idea how to say your guys' production company name because it's like Dutch, Finnish. What do you speak in that language? I'm uneducated. I'm an American, and all I know is America. No, just kidding. That's what it feels like sometimes, but right, that makes sense. Finland speaks Finnish. Yeah, that checks out. That checks out. All right. Let's move over here into our game scene. For those that are joining later on and going to be watching this video, they're probably like, okay, Alex, shut your mouth and get to the tutorial. So in this particular tutorial, we're going to be deep diving into all of the different mechanics in GDevelop, going through the IDE process, um, and enjoying that. So for those that don't know and they're watching the chat system, or if you're watching us live later, check out Rami's channel. They're working on quite a few games. They've been working on games for quite a long time. I will say that. They've got a vast array on their Discord server, and recently I've been contributing some of my user experience education with that with the developers, and have made myself in as a credit. Additionally, I am working on some potential audio work with the company as well. Great stuff. I'm a huge fan of retro gaming, and their current game, Galactic Neon Blitz, is very much reminiscent of some of the greatest classic games known to humanity. So if you are interested in learning a little bit about that, go check out their channels, go check out their social media. It's amazing stuff. All built within the game development or G develop community. I'm not sure about all their projects, but obviously I do know that for the last many years it has been here. So, anyways, please correct me if I'm wrong, and whatever else you'd like to say in chat, and I'll relay that message forward. So getting started with GDevelop, I'm going to be editing this video into something shorter and more direct. So feel free to ask me questions, and of course, I would love to share any insights and touch those topics with you on the live stream. And then I'll do all the editing afterwards. So don't you guys worry. Ask me whatever you want, and I will do my best to answer. So first, I would like to talk about the origin of GDevelop. And those of you might not be some of you might not be interested in the history of it, but for Ian, I don't know how to pronounce it. Ian is what I know, but for Ian is their Discord tag and their GDevelop, or I mean GitHub. In 2008, GDevelop began under the development of Is it an L or an I? Forlan? I actually don't know. I think it's an I. But yeah, I still don't even know how to express their full name. Anyways, in 2018, the project launched as Game Develop. Oh yeah, Forian. Okay, that's what I thought so. Um, and in that process, um, it was originally launched as Game Develop. Later down in about 2015 or so, it switches over to G Develop, and the reason why is that for SEO purposes, and which is search engine optimization, for showing up on search engines like Google, especially back in that age where SEO was critical for the foundation and the laying groundwork of the internet. And of course, this starts all the way in the late 80s into the 90s, when that originally was started. But um, the entire engine is written in HTML, which is the foundating language for the web. And it was originally developed, just so you know, as a way to send documents over vast spaces. And we can actually thank the infrastructure of the medical society, or medical institutions at large, as well as a deep desire to be able to transfer information and documents quickly over vast differences, including oceans and other things like that. And so the hypertext language was developed with that foundation in mind. And as HTML grew, that is still today the backbone of all of the internet. Um, it doesn't matter what you do on the internet, there has to be some level of this language called HTML. Um, so moving beyond that, it's adopted some JavaScript in its foundations, and that started as an open source project around late 2008, I want to say. Now there are other in my previous video, I had mentioned that Godot is actually older than GDevelop, and at a first glance, that may be true, or that would be not true. At first glance, you would see that Godot was created and launched in 2011, or actually launched publicly in 2014. Um, and But it originates in Argentina in 2001, and they started as a project for private use, and it didn't come around until about 2014 as a public release. So it took them 13 years to go from a private product using that source, developing into what we know today as Godot. Around the same time as GDevelop launched, we also saw, or back when we saw Game Develop launch, we saw Construct come to the market as well, and these two have been competitors ever since. So if this looks familiar to you, it's because they come from the same time period, the same release era of technology. And one thing that I will say is that I believe GDevelop has the superior interface to any of these sort of markets. Now, I've learned today that there is some back-end GDevelop that is much different in terms of open source technologies. They claim to be open source, but there's a lot of proprietary work going on behind the door, and you can't just fork it and hope that it works. So there is some things that could be addressed, and still there's room to grow here. So before you ever decide what engine to use, you should generally come up with a game idea. I think recently Pirate Software came out with a conversation around this, and they call it the GEL version, the game itself, the engine, and then the language you're going to use. And what Riley had just recently said in chat was that GDevelop is fast for HTML and JavaScript. Well, that's because HTML was designed to be fast, and JavaScript even more so. JavaScript allows us to do a lot of really fast, high-end rendering inside of the HTML code concepts, and partnering with HTML to display these things incredibly quickly. And so that's why. And also, JavaScript, fundamentally, can be exported into numerous other languages, and it can be used as a translator into another language, and so you can actually use other scripts to change your code over. So potentially there's a lot of potential here in GDevelop. Hey, Phoenix Sapphire, welcome. I can do that. And I will go deeper into that. And so thank you for coming in for one and hanging out. I would like to answer that question for you, but right now I would like to focus on the engine a little bit. So if you want to come back a little bit later, you can, or if you don't mind hanging out and learning a little bit more about the engine, or if there's other questions I can ask about or answer about this engine specifically, I'd love to do that. But I can definitely deep dive those concepts for you. I'd love to do that. So, and also thank you for watching my videos. Really appreciate you. I do. So, let's dive into this. So with the, and I'll put a comment into the section for other people coming to watch the video. I'm trying to get better about my tags and how I document things, but do know, ladies and gentlemen, that I will be marking on this one when we actually start beginning about the actual concepts of GDevelop. So roughly 13 minutes. So anyways, let's begin with the overview of GDevelop. Something that I would like to bring everyone's attention to is on the desktop and cloud versions of GDevelop. The environment looks almost identical. And there is a subscription service that is tied into GDevelop, but what it allows you to do is have more cloud saves. That is only true on the desktop and cloud version. If you are using the mobile developed version, there is a restriction to the amount of event sheets that you can have, which is very similar to the way that Construct monetizes their platform. That's one version that I will say publicly I do not agree with. Because it is an open source platform, there should be a different way of funding that without going into that. So that one issue aside, most people's use cases is you should be developing in a desktop environment. So whether it's the browser or the desktop version, they look identical. So with that aside, let's jump into the actual conversation on how do we use this setup? How do we go about learning GDevelop? Well, GDevelop's layout and engine, and yes, Remy is right. You can, in fact, use the GDevelop version freely. There is no restriction. The actual desktop version has absolutely no restrictions in it, except for branding. And if you want to remove that, okay. But for what it is and how it's compiled, very user-friendly, and I highly recommend this as a product to anyone. So, all right, that aside, no more clarifications. That aside, now let's see what the timestamp is. We're going to say at 15 minutes, we really begin here. So here we are in the setup of our environment. In the very beginning, you won't even be logged in. Well, so Riley, actually, you can't do that. And the reason is because, and I just found this out today, although GDevelop is quote-unquote open source, there is a major backend that is proprietary that you wouldn't be able to access if you forked it. A lot of the services that render out would not function. You would not have access to the store, the tutorials, or any of those tools if you fork the software. So, mind you, you would have to build a lot of the backend yourself. However, it would still work technically. But it is much more complicated than I originally thought. One second, my phone is vibrating. Let me turn that off. Okay, so with those clarifications aside, what you're first going to see is the initial getting started page. It will look like this. You won't be signed in, and you'll be able to create an account from here. There'll be, I believe, a setup phase that you'll go through before you get to this point. And if you don't already have GDevelop in your browser, you can very easily go to, let me pull this open for you. If you want to access the editor itself, you can go to editor.gdevelop.io, or you can very simply just go, if you want to go to gdevelop, it's gdevelop.io. And you can click on the download section. You can either launch it in the web browser, as we previously discussed, or you can download it for the various systems. Now, again, to show you that it is the same environment, here we are. I just launched the editor, and you can see that it is the same skin as the desktop version. So we're going to switch back over to the desktop because that's my preferred working environment. And also, there are, if you have spotty internet connection or want to work mostly offline, then the desktop version is pretty much the only one that you can use, as well as it allows you to save your files locally. That's important because on the cloud, you are completely dependent on the autosave function, and if without a subscription, you cannot revert your saves backwards. So if it autosaves and you're not paying attention, there is a manual save that's stored on your computer and an auto update save. And if those come out of sync, you get one opportunity to launch from the manual save, or it overwrites it with the new save. So you got to be very careful. I recommend working in the desktop environment. It is the standard use case for this, but if you're restricted to a phone, we got to work with what you got. So as you get started, you enter into the main user interface, and the only real things that you should really pay attention to here, or that are even relevant to most users, is the preference. If you'd like to change your UI theme or reset the layout after you've changed it or something, you can access that here. You may want to change your shortcuts or the folder in which we download all of our local builds into. That's where you access that information. Otherwise, there's not really much going on there. And if you like to snoop around, you can, but it's not really relevant. The next feature is the Let's Get Started, which will take you to the a condensed version of the learning section. And in here, I highly recommend anybody who's getting started to watch and go through each of these components to learn all of the base functionality of how these games work. From video games to interactive content, app development and tool development to teaching and learning, the GDevelop platform is capable of doing all of these things. And you can dive into those a little bit more. But further is the Learn section. And this is the small tutorials built by GDevelop to get you started. And after you've completed both sections, you should be in a great place to be able to navigate the menu on your own and really dive into it that way. There's the play area where you can play other people's games, maybe even get inspiration and ideas for what you would like to do. There's quite a few well-developed projects in here, and I highly recommend those that are interested to go and check this out. So beyond that, we have the shop, of course, where you can pick up various other asset packs. And maybe in the future, by the time you guys are seeing this, there may, in fact, be a asset pack from me on there. As I'm working on a few. But to get items into the marketplace, you got to go through a rather refined process of naming and establishing your assets. So it is a bit of a work. But there will be assets from me later on. Okay, so the meat and potatoes of this application are in the build menu. So at 20 minutes, we're talking about the build menu. So the build menu is where you begin all of your projects. You can click on the browse all templates, but that is a little bit misleading because it doesn't have all of the templates. These are all of the templates that have been greenlit by GDevelop, but there's far more that you should know about. The only way that you can reach them is by going to File, going to Create, and going to New Project from a template. When you get into this new project area, you can scroll down and see other templates that are available from the community that doesn't have images, and they aren't officially supported by the developers. And so maybe there's a lot of who knows what's going on here, but you miss so much of what GDevelop has to offer if you don't check out these amazing, amazing templates. So I do recommend you do that. If you like to learn about all these different things, you can learn about inventory systems. There's a reflective water surface template by Vegetato. There's lots of really cool things that you can do, or you can watch my tutorial series as we digest through various different live streams how to develop these style of games. And you can watch all of it live, which means you can copy my code, or later you can buy or in some cases get a free template by going to my itch page or checking out my portfolio on GDevelop. So that aside, and going backwards, we have the major build menu. So if you're going to be building a project from scratch, hey, what's going on? Registro? I'm terrible with names. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to say registro, like registration, registro. Anyways. Oh, I see. Uruguay. Oh, do you... I'm going to guess you drink mate. There's no way you live in Uruguay. Uruguay? I can never say that either. But mate, yerba mate, is delicious, by the way. Delicious. I get... yeah. Anyways, so back to the project at hand. Teaching you how to use GDevelop. So now that we've digested how to browse these ready-made games or templates that you can buy right here, the most important button is, of course, for everyone, the create button. So I want to dive into this project really quick. So here is the develop a project section. In this section, we have a mobile portrait, the desktop mobile landscape version, which is in 1280 by 720, and then the full desktop or a custom size. Now, you might wonder, what should I select for my game development? Well, even though this is a more mobile portrait, the interesting thing about the mobile portrait version, which is the 720 by 1280, the inverse. Now, most phones and things today, let's say you're recording a YouTube short, the standard definition would be 1080 by 1920. And in that development, in that format, you can actually develop a lot of things. And so there's a game called Downwell. I think it's called Downwell. And in that game, it's a 2D platformer where you just go down, like just fall down. And so you keep between the wall edges and you go straight down. Now it's available on multiple platforms, and it was developed for mobile use, but there may be use cases where you want that style of format. You could go with this, and this would be native support for all phones. And that's why it's in a lower resolution. Now, in desktop format, the desktop mobile format, while this will still work in most mobile situations with modern day phones, it is still a use case scenario where you want to support older devices, go at a lower resolution. Now, in gaming, we used to have in classic formats a 4:3 resolution perspective. And like when we look at classic consoles like the Super Nintendo, the regular Nintendo, Sega, all of that, we have variations of canvas sizes, but as canvases grew, we switched over from a 4:3, and as widescreen entered into the gaming industry and television at large, in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, we transitioned into a widescreen format of 16:9. And we can digest that down into various bite sizes, but the smallest version of that really, I would say, is acceptable unless you're trying to develop with a very retro feel for a specific console in mind, is 320 by 180. And if we multiply that up, it not only goes into 720, but it also goes into 1080. Now, at original 4:3 resolution, we were able to get pretty close to this market as we upscaled, and especially on older consoles, there was a slight differential. Like I don't know if you know this or not, but the original Nintendo had a larger screen canvas than the Super Nintendo, but the Super Nintendo had the ability to have 256 colors, which ultimately um, upgraded to I lost my train of thought. What was I gonna say? In the Super Nintendo, because of the 256 resolution, even though the screen is technically smaller, it looked more detailed because of the palette that we could use. And in today's modern engines, we have we don't need to consider any of that. We don't need to consider how many pixels we can do unless we're trying to do something classic influenced. And so out of a 256 total color palette, that left us with so many choices rather than 8-bit or 6-bit or 16-bit. And so that's kind of just a little bit of history into that. So if you want to develop a game in GDevelop, most people are going to select this. And so I'm going to edit that everything I just said into a snippet, probably outside of the video, or you'll have to watch the video, this whole video, the tutorial, to understand this. But we're going to skip to what's actually important. And what's actually important here is accessing the standard. So most everybody's going to click this button, and you can name your project whatever you want. In this one, we're going to name it Faded Crown, and I want to save this on the GDevelop cloud. Again, I could save it on my personal computer, but we're going to use the cloud. So it doesn't really matter. You can change this name at any point in time later, and GDevelop does have the AI prompt where we could type in a brief description of what we might want, and it'll select free resources that are available from the market, import them, and give you a rough scene. But more often than not, this really doesn't work, in my opinion. It gives you some very rudimentary bases, but I want to show you how to do that on your own. So we're going to disallow authentication in our game. Authentication allows us, and we can add this back at any time, but it allows us to use the built-in GDevelop login system and username tracking for things like leaderboards and other features that are built into the proprietary side of GDevelop, but you can use them for your games, or if you want to select the username as they load into your game and give them, to store information in. But for our game, we don't need that. However, we are going to optimize for pixel art because guess what? I work in pixel art. Probably so do you. But this engine doesn't just do pixel art. It does 3D, and they recently added splining, spining, spines. And you can do the paper animation style now in GDevelop, which wasn't really available before. You had to export it from a different software and bring it in. So big changes are happening in GDevelop 5. So if you're watching the news in those feeds, you're going to be learning about that. Anyways, so now that we have that set up, we can jump into Exotic Sail is our project name. Again, we can change it later. We're going to create the project. Once we get started in GDevelop, we are met with a very blank canvas and screen. And a lot of this information we simply don't need at the very beginning of our learning development process. I'm seeing in chat, hey, listen, you're 30, I'm 30, and so we're not too far apart. My brother my older brother is as old as you are, and we both very much. I mean, he was born 86, so the year of the Nintendo. How could you not like pixel art and be born the year the Nintendo released globally? Come on, like, if you're a gamer and you're from that era. Listen, Riley, there is absolutely nothing wrong in being young. In fact, that's where most of us started in our development age. You have the benefit of having older folks pioneer the path for you. Now more than ever, coding is accessible, the knowledge is everywhere, and you can learn. Anybody can learn how to do this without any education. That's the beautiful thing about it, right? And buddy, you're getting started at an age where by the time you're my age, you will be leagues ahead of where I am now if you stay committed to your learning process. I believe in you. So, moving forward here, let me digest for you what is going on in this engine. So right away, we have object groups. Now, object groups, I want to talk about this first before we get into the settings and everything else, because we're going to talk about what's on the page first, and then what we can navigate to off of this page. So very first, we have object groups, and this is the first thing that you can actually minimize. And the reason why is because unlike in other programs, in programming languages, where a parent inherits all of we would put all of our settings into a parent. Um, the scene groups don't work that way, where we don't add the programming to the parent object, we add it to the children. And so that might be a concept that's hard to understand if you don't know coding, but effectively, I just want you to know that right now we don't need it, and later in our tutorial series and other things that I show you, I'll show you how to use it the most effective way and how it interacts with the system. So for right now, we can close that, and we can simply do that by closing it looks like a bunch of boxes. We can just close that down. Now, we do have this section, which is our objects panel, and this we're going to use constantly. So we don't need to close this. Unless you have a small screen, you can really keep this open, and I highly suggest that you do. So we have scene objects and we have global objects. Now, for the most part in GDevelop, we start with what we call a scene, which is this here. This and this combined together, our untitled scene, is technically one scene, but it's comprised of two components of GDevelop. The first component is what we call a layout, and the second component is what we call an event sheet or events. And so if you click on this goofy looking menu down here, this is the project manager. I think that they could have chosen a better picture for it because it's so close to the hamburger menu that the hamburger menu is how you access all of the typical file, edit, view formats. But this is how you access your actual project. So we'll be interacting with that button a lot in our development process. So focus on that. A hamburger menu, for those that don't know, is what this is called. It's the layered format, the 3 lines. The actual technical term is hamburger menu, believe it or not. And so we use these menus in web development often, but they're hamburger menus. And generally because you click on them and then it expands something. It's kind of like reviewing the layers of a hamburger. But in this particular case, we have this goofy little thing, which is 3 cubes. And we can access, again, our property settings for our game. So we can change our game name, we can add a description here, and most of this is for when we publish or release our content in a digestible way to other people. And this is where we edit all of that, from branding to the game properties, including our resolution. So we can actually change our resolution at any point in time, but I'll show you kind of how we go about doing this. And one of the things that most people encounter, and the first error in GDevelop, is as they add their pixeled characters to this canvas, they forget that their character is absolutely tiny. So if you have a 16 by 16 character, you would have to evolve them like times 4 or more to equal a game size sprite character that you would normally see in a game like this. Now, there is much easier ways to do that. We can zoom in the camera instead in the engine, but we'll dive into those more advanced mechanics later on. So we're going to work with what we got, excuse me. And so 1280 by 720 is what we're going to start with. We're going to allow this stretching of the window. We can do it either via width, height, or no changes. There are reasons why you may or may not want this and why you may change them. But for now, we can leave absolutely everything alone here. And I'm just going to press cancel. Now, inside of our icons and thumbnails, this is the desktop icon, the iOS, the Google, wherever we're releasing, this is what the thumbnail will look like to people. And so you can fix and edit those settings later on if you'd like. Global variables are variables that we can access on the greater scale of our project. These are variables that are accessible no matter what scene or layout we're in. And I'll explain how those work a little bit later. But for now, we don't need this either. We would bind like our game controller inputs here. We could add various other variables that we would want to, including player health. We can pretty much put any variable we want here, and they're interchangeable, whether it's a scene variable, which I'll talk about in a minute, or a object variable, or like a player object variable. So there's a lot of ways that we can use these. Some techniques are better than others, but you can put those here, and I want you to know that you can access these no matter where you are. And that works the same as objects, but there's a different way that global and scene objects work in GDevelop that may be relevant for you to know. And so we'll digest that here in a second. So underneath that, we have resources. Now, every time we add something to the resource section, like a game sprite or a tile set or anything like that, it'll get added over here in our resource section. And so I can demonstrate that very quickly by going to our game scene, adding a new object. We can also right click and insert something new, but we're going to go to our object. We're going to add a sprite, and we can name it whatever we want right now. We're going to click create in Pyxel, and I'm not going to change anything out of the gate. We're just going to make a black cube, and we're going to click save. So now it's importing the project into resources. So what does that mean? Once we hit apply, it saves the object. If we didn't hit apply, it would cancel out and delete the object. But now we can go here to our resources section, and we can see that our sprite has been loaded. Now, sometimes you may want to change a sprite in an object. What happens if you're on the cloud version and you go to change this sprite, say you've already, let's say you make a player sprite, and then later you update that player sprite and you want to change the image. Well, if you just add the sprite here and the image is named the same thing, say you overwrote it on your, overwrite, when you save and overwrite a project on your PC and then re-upload it with the same file name into GDevelop, there's going to be it will upload, but then the image is going to look exactly like the one that you previously uploaded. And the reason why is because inside of your scene object, or inside of your resources folder, that cube named the same thing is taking priority. And so if you remove an object, so we can now go into here and we can delete this object from our game. However, when we do that and we say yes and remove it, it's still inside of our resources. Now, this is something that you really should pay attention to, and most people won't even know that this feature exists. So what you should do is right-click, remove unused, and remove resources of any kind that are no longer used in your project. And this will clear the cache effectively of any files that are named the same that you don't want. You remove them and then delete them here. And also, when you package your game and ship it, you want that to be as effective and clean as possible for everyone involved. There's no reason uploading a game somewhere and uploading unnecessary files. Also, if you have files that you're not ready to release yet in your game, they could be accessed here if you allow it to be downloaded, and they could pull those resources out of your game, and that's how game leaks happen. So mind your resources and manage your game effectively, and we won't have that issue. Okay, so now we get to what most people are like, come on, dude, I need your help. Like, tell me how to use this engine. Don't tell me all the things I don't really need to know right now. So here's what you need to know right now. The untitled scene is this factor right here. This is what we talked about this earlier. Now, I can rename this at any point in time by right-clicking or clicking the dots and clicking edit. And that would open this scene normally, or in this case, we can simply just rename it. And I can change this to say, we're going to call this our game scene. Now, if you have it open, don't be alarmed. It's going to close. You press enter, and your project, it is closed. What happened? Well, you renamed the game scene, and it will take us back here, but you're still actually inside of your project. It just closed that scene for you. So you go in here and you just double click your scene and it'll... All right, well, I slapped my phone. Um, let's see. Sorry, I slapped my phone away and I lost my train of thought. Let me give me just a second here. Yep, phone's good. Phone's good. I just I slapped it so hard it flew off my desk and disconnected from the wall. So I just had to go fetch my phone. I was being very animated in the explanation. I'm glad I didn't have my coffee up here, or I would have slapped my cup, sending it to oblivion. Anyways, so now that we open the scene and we have our game scene, I want to explain just a little bit deeper into what these two features down here before we talk about extensions. So we have an external event sheet and we have an external layout. Well, how do these work and how do they work inside of GDevelop? Well, an external event is literally, if we just keep it untitled, we can launch it and it asks us something very specific. What scene do we want to bind this script with? This means what scene, the game scene, in this particular case, if we choose the scene, is our only one available because we don't have other game scenes. But maybe this event is only for a menu. So we would only want to add this event sheet to as an additional menu. Or if you've seen some of my other videos, you see that I build finite state machines and those scripts need to be accessible to the main script feature. So effectively, it's like importing one code sheet into another and allows it to be called at the same time as all of the other events. So that's how you tie them in. And but this, if you look at it, once we select it, is the same thing as this. They look exactly the same. One is just an external, a singular version, not bound to a layout. And so this is what a layout is. So then when we go down and create an external layout, you'll see that when I launch it, although these are named the same, they're not bound as we see here in the parentheses. So they're, and when we click the scene, we can also add this layout, right? And choose it. And now we have just this layout. It's a standalone camera, layer system, and layout, but it's still accessible from other scenes if we import it into this scene. So even though it's bound, as we did with the external events, there's another step we need to do to call it into our game function. And you'll see in other videos I've done how to do this, and I don't want to dive into that feature right now because it's a bit more advanced. So what I'm going to do is, just for the clarity's sake, is remove these two files, which you can click on the dots and remove. These can't be undone. And now we're going to go to our game scene. So before I'm not going to talk about extensions. I didn't forget. I'm actually skipping over it because there's other things that you need to learn how to do first. So now I believe that we're just about ready to begin our project. If you happen to know the size of your pixel art without importing it, say you're an artist and you want to add your own art, or you found it outside of the GDevelop community, outside of the store page or asset page, if you will, you may know what the size is of your canvas, or the way that the, like, is it 16 by 16? Is it 8 by 8? Is it 32 by 32? And what we want to do generally, this will make your game project very clean and easy to navigate. If we click on the grid or the hashtag looking the tic-tac-toe board, we can set up a grid. And innately, it's at 32 by 32, but I think a lot of you will be developing in 16 by 16 when you first get started, because a lot of gaming sprites that are free are generally in this size category. We can make it isometric and we can do some offsets to really get a custom look, but for now we're going to stick to the standard. And so I'm going to apply this at 16 by 16, and then we're going to go show grid. And this now allows us to drag and drop things, and once we show the grid, it will automatically snap objects to the grid. So the very next question is, okay, well, how do I then get started developing my game? And what can I do in GDevelop without writing a single thing of code? And so a lot of what you hear about GDevelop is that you can build entire games without writing a single line of code. And that is true, although somewhat misleading, because there's a lot of things, advanced features, and some convenience things that you might want, like remapping your game controls or doing a custom format for your button keys that aren't pre-built into the game. So we're going to get started with a scene object. So any object that you want accessible to this layout and all the layouts that you bind to it, you add a scene object. Now, a global object is an object that's accessible outside of the scene. If I was making a menu for my game, I would make a new scene and not a external layout, because they're entirely different functions, and a lot of the sprites and things that you use in that development won't be necessary across the entire spectrum. Now, if you wanted to make an additional level for your game, you could make a layout, because the black line here is the canvas, or where the camera sees your game, and you can develop outside of this zone to add more things to your game without needing to build an external scene. So they don't necessarily snap side by side. I don't want you to think about it that way. They're just a bigger, it's just where your camera defaultly is on this canvas. Technically, if we zoom out, you have all of this space where you can develop whatever you want. It's an infinite canvas, effectively. But we can move our camera around in our game, sort of like this, but we have to use coding and programming to do that. So for now, though, we have our default view, and we're pretty much ready to run a game. So what we need to do, just to dive into how to function this, I believe the best place to start is by adding a player character and showing you how we bind a player's movement at the very beginning. So we can create a new object, and we can click the sprite. Now, if we import an image, we can import our own asset, or we can choose from the asset store. Now, if you use the AI generated stuff, it may have already imported a character, but we're going to go to the 16 by 16 and look at what we have available to us in this format. And we're just going to select a player character or something from one of these. So I'm looking through what I want to add to my game. There's other ways to add things to your project, but this lets you search the market for something specific. So I want to start by adding we'll say the female idol animation for the sprite. Now, I just added the one PNG because an animation is multiple files. So I'd have to go back into that section and go back down to that character and select every piece of that idol script. And it's a little monotonous if you do it this way. You can also, if you just saw what I did, is click on this arrow and then go to choose from asset store, and you can skip the other dialog process. And we just want to make sure that we get all of the idle 1, 2, 3. We need 3, and we have 2 more to import. And then one more time, we're going to import that last one. There's other better ways to do importing, but I want to show you the noob way, the way that new people will be doing this. So we can preview, and we can, it's important that idle animations and other things we do a loop for. So if we don't do a loop animation, it will only play once in our game. But if we want our character to truly idle, we use loops. And this is how our game would look. And we can speed up or slow this down by changing some of these values. So if we do 0.0 to 15, for example, we can see how many frames a second. We're getting faster and faster. So I want to increase this to, we were at 8 previously, I think. No, we were at 0.8. Let's go to 1.25 and see if, so that's 8 frames a second. Although there's only 4 frames, we're doubling the amount of frames in one loop cycle effectively by increasing the game speed, and knowing that we only have 4 frames, we can do it by 8, and it gives it a nice pace. If you don't like this, you could do, for example, 4, and we can recycle, and we see that it's running every frame per second. It's a bit slow for 4 frames. We run about 8 to 12 frames a second whenever we do a standard animation in this engine. So you can tinker around with that as you like. I personally like this double up on the frame. I think it's smooth, slow enough to be seen, And so we can just hit OK, and now this whole system will loop in at that speed. So we're gonna write the animation of idle, and this allows us, because inside of the engine we can access animation frames via the number 0, because in an array, anytime we're doing programming, we begin with the 0 value. The first item we add is always at the 0 position, and then we add 1 from that. So the first item is always 0. It's a little bit weird compared to normal math, but we need to remember that in a lot of cases, particularly when it comes to arrays. And so we're uploading these animations in a way that is accessible through an array system. And so it starts at 0. But now we can also access it via the name. And so we can name this player, or maybe player sprite, whatever you would like to do, depending on how you're going to build your character. But we're just going to call it player. And then we have an idle sequence. Now, there's some extra features that we might want to deal with, like the collision value of our character and other things like points. Points are, we can create objects at a point location. Each object has an origin point, a center automatically, and we can add our own custom points later on. That's more of an advanced feature, and for now, we're going to leave this alone. It's important that at the beginning, we unify all of our point locations. Like our player, we might, instead of having the origin point at the top left corner like it currently is, you can also click on these and it'll highlight the one in blue that you're selecting. And you could put this down, say, at your player's feet, and when you put it in the map and how the player renders in the game, it'll use that point as, let's say, the bottom of your player. It is the spawning location of the sprite. And across animations, if you want them to flow well, you should keep that uniform. And so whatever you do, decide where you're going to keep that. For now, we're going to keep it in the top corner. That's okay for us. And the collision mask is where how we collide with objects. You may want this to be more inside of your character, say, so that there's a little bit of extra overlap with the tile set, or you don't collide, you don't get killed from an object that's not actually touching your player. So you could change those here, but we're going to leave that alone. I just wanted to explain to you that it is there. If you ever need to create your own sprite, you could use Pyxel, but there are other free alternatives. And if you're interested in playing around with pixel art and you don't have any money, I highly recommend you use LibreSprite. LibreSprite is an original, back when Sprite was first developed, it was done under an open source license, and later on they went to a closed source license. And what that means is that usually at the very beginning, people could create their own version of that software, and that's the origin of LibreSprite. And so if you are interested in getting a sprite but don't have the funds for it and want a similar user experience, LibreSprite is what I would recommend over Pyxel. Pyxel is something, though, if you don't have any other choice, highly recommend, because it is pretty much, I mean, there it is, right? If you don't have any other choice, you have but one. But even on mobile, there are other programs like what is it called? I was gonna say I think it's called Pyxel Studio. And that's free as well, and it allows you to do layers, animations, and all sorts of good stuff. But I digress. So we have an idle animation. We could add another animation and call it death or hurt or jump, for example, and we would upload those sprites here. I'm not going to do that in this example, but you could do that if you wanted to. Now we get into behaviors. So I generally say that once you create your basic structure, we hit apply, so that way we don't accidentally delete our character. We don't want to, it's happened to me so many times. It's just a good idea to save often and also apply your settings more often as you're learning the software. So just get in the habit of, if you do mess something up, say you move a point and you don't want to, you can hit close just like you normally would, which isn't the actual apply button. You have to hit apply to save that setting. If you hit cancel and hit cancel again instead of continue editing, it will reset whatever you've just done, and that includes everything. So you could end up spending 20 minutes in here refining and addressing some changes and then accidentally clear it out because you weren't paying attention. So be mindful of that as you're working. Now, behaviors. This is where extensions matter and why I wanted to wait on extensions. So a behavior is I can't spell physics. There we go. So in our behavior, this is what you would normally see. So when we click on add behavior, this is how we access the extensions feature. If you don't know about extensions, you really should listen to all of these great tooltips. There is a tooltip pretty much in all of the major sections of GDevelop, and most of them are done by Helper Wesley, who, if you don't know, was an original creator on YouTube for GDevelop or Game Develop, and has now become a member of their team, as well as continues to produce their content. He makes really good digestible information. So if you haven't seen him on YouTube, go check him out. And also, if you have, make sure you also watch the GDevelop, because he does those as well. So here we can add the various different settings to our game, and also to our objects and what have you. So when we click on the behavior section, it's anticipating that we have already added the extension that we want to use. If there's an extension that you know of that you haven't used yet, that you might want to add to your game, you can click on create or search a new extension and find all sorts of extensions here underneath this tab. And similarly to the way that the templates work, like we talked about earlier, you need to click the show community extensions to see the unofficial reviewed ones. These ones haven't been approved technically, but there are many that do work, and you should look at them. If they don't work, generally they'll say something like depreciated, or at least in the official ones, you may run into something that says depreciated, and you should pay attention to that because it means it's no longer supported by the current version of GDevelop. Lots of stuff going on here, but they are clearly defined at whether or not they are a community extension or a supported extension. Sorry. So now that we have that information out of the way, we're not going to do anything yet except for adding health points and damage to our player. Now, you could code this manually, but these extensions are code that has been converted inside of GDevelop into an extension for ease of use for you. And we can dive into how to make extensions another time and how they work, but just know that those are made generally within the engine and also using a language called gd.js or gamedevelop.javascript. And there's some documentation on that if you want to learn how to do the physical coding aspect of using JavaScript inside of GDevelop, but we're going to use just the basics in this tutorial. So now that we've added the health behavior, we can go back to our player, go to the behaviors list for this object. So right now we are in something called an object. An object is a sprite, a texture, or pretty much anything you add to the game that is a visual or functional element of your game. And now that we have a player, we want to decide, are we a platforming character or are we a top-down player? Are we moving in 4 directions or 8 directions, or are we running on a platform? And in this particular demonstration, we're going to use a platform character just because of my familiarity with it, but also a lot of people are interested in making platformers. So if you are interested in a top-down, it's the same thing. You just add the other behavior. Innately, it has default controls, which are your arrow keys and the space key to jump. And those are just predefined with this behavior. Like I said before, some behaviors are developed using the engine in the back end using programming that is in the event scripts. And effectively, they just predefine those key buttons as the appropriate ones to do. If you were working on mobile, you may want to add a mobile movement function. Those are all behaviors that you can add yourself. So in platforming, we're going to keep this button clicked because we haven't added any of the code to change it. And we're just going to leave it as it is. So as it currently is, if we add our object to the game screen and press the play button, we're going to fall through the map because it's adding gravity to our player and treating it as though it has all of the coding it needs to be a platform character. So we're going to hit review and we're going to watch our player fall out of the map. Okay, well, that was pretty straightforward. Alex, how do I stop my player from falling out of the map? How does this work? Well, we need to add another behavior, and it needs to be a sprite, or there's a few other things it could be. It technically could be almost anything, but in this particular case, we're going to use a sprite, and we want to make a collision sprite. So collision, and you can watch more in depth on how to do this inside of my previous tutorials, especially on how to make a Celeste platformer. So you can now create something. So I don't have something prepared, so we're just going to create it here in Pyxel. We're using a 16 by 16 tile set format, so we're going to resize this canvas. It starts at 32. We're going to resize it to 16:16, maintain the aspect ratio, click resize. Now that we have a new canvas that is appropriately 16 by 16, which we can check on our resize, we can click resize and see that it has gone into effect. If it's not, you'll very clearly be able to tell this will say 32 by 32. So we're just going to fill this bucket with a red color. So going down here, selecting it to be a red box, and we're just going to fill that box all the way up and click save. Now we have a red box that is our collision. I am using a sprite here, but in most cases, you probably want to use a tiled sprite. And the reason is because it becomes repeatable. If you use a regular sprite, like we have done with our player, and you stretch the player, it doesn't repeat the texture, it stretches the texture or the sprite. And so with collision, because it's one solid color, we can stretch it. But if we had like a block and we added a black outline to this sprite, and just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, I'll do that now, where I'll add this cube around, or the black around it, and save this and hit apply. We can see that we're stretching this out. Not great, but you can avoid that by using a tiled sprite instead. So going to our tiled sprite, I can choose the new sprite that we just created from that tile list, add it to our game, and right away you can see that now it will tile that sprite. So if I turn off the grid, you'll be able to see that rather than stretching it, it continuously creates it. So we're going to use that instead. I just wanted to show you what you might try to do and what's the best way to do it, and show you how these tiles work separately. So now that we have that basic functionality, we need to go to our scene. We're going to call this collision as well. And it doesn't really matter. We're going to set its default height and weight, or its size, to 16 by 16, just to make sure that it stays within the parameter of our grid. And we're going to drag it back in here, double click on it again, go to behaviors, and add a behavior called platform. Now this innately adds the ability to use the platform behavior on this object, which means it will function as a collision object for the player. It has nothing to do with the name that I gave it. It has everything to do with the behavior I gave it, or the extension. And so we don't want grabbing of the edge in our game, because we want it to be a traditional platformer. So we're just going to turn that off and hit apply. Now if we run our game, we can see that our player not only is on it, but if we use our arrow keys and jump button, we can, without any coding at all, we can begin developing some sort of prototype. So if we were to fall off this edge, that would be it. We have no respawn button. We have nothing like that. It's just how it works. So you might be thinking, well, okay, but that's really far away. Like, is there a way to zoom in the screen? Well, if we stretch the screen, it maintains the stretched right now it just maintains the screen, and it'll stretch the canvas to fit that screen, but it won't move the tile set around. It'll keep its position, but all we're doing really is moving this bar farther. There's other ways that we can scale this or do no scaling. Like I showed you before in the property settings, we can change it down here and say no changes to the window. Hit apply, and we'll close that example, click preview again, and look at it. And when we shrink our game, now there's no stretching and no variation, so it'll always remain the same aspect. There are reasons to do it this way. It works good for mobile devices, so something you might consider in your development process. But for now, we want to actually change our game to be zoomed in. Well, had we developed our canvas on a smaller scale, like that 320 by 180, we would then be at a perfect resolution for this classic style and look. However, right now, without changing that, there's another way to do that. And so I want to introduce you to game scene events. So now that we have the layout, we may want to start programming our game and changing up the controls and learning the basics of how GDevelop works. Well, to do that, we go into our game scene, and because it's already an event tied to our layout, we don't have to link it like we did previously with the other extended features. We just click on add an event, and we have an event sheet, the very beginning of our code base. We can watch this video, and I do recommend it if you haven't already seen this. If you didn't listen to my advice in the beginning, do so now, but we can close that if we don't want to see it and start from here. Every time we add an event to our event sheet, we get this. This is called an event. We have a condition, which is a if statement. If something is true, if this setting is valid in any degree, so player, if our gravity is equal to X amount, if our opacity is set to something, if there is an effect in order. This is the if side of our statement, the condition of our statement. What must be true, or what must equal something to some degree for this to be triggered. And so we can say at the beginning of our scene, so this is at the very, before anything else happens, we want to run something at the beginning of our scene. So at the beginning of our scene, we're going to run this script, and this will only run one time. So we don't need to add a condition of run one time. This is just at the beginning of the scene, we want something to happen. So at the beginning of the scene, if this is true, we want to add a condition, and we have a player and a collision. But we want to do something a little bit extra. At the beginning of our scene, we're going to type camera and access our camera controller. Now there's another way to do this, and if you're just learning, I recommend you do it this way to become a little bit more familiar with the back end of how it works, but this can also be confusing because you might not know what to look for. But if we click on other actions, go down to layers and cameras and click it, we can then see the same features that we would see if we searched it. This is just refined in an easier way. But not everything that you add to the game, including extensions, may be visible in this department. And so there are, and also between conditions and actions, or the left and right side of your event script, left being conditions, right being actions, we're going to make something happen. So we're going to make our camera center on our player. And the default camera is 0. We don't really need to be using this change of camera, right? We don't need to change anything on the camera is what I mean to say, because out of the box, it just works. And we're targeting a specific layer on the camera. Depending on where you put the objects in your game scene, you might need to center different cameras for different reasons. But for now, as it currently stands, we have a base layer where we've already put our character, and we are centering on the object. And we don't have to type 0. It defaultly goes there, but just to show you, default is 0. So at the beginning of the scene, we're going to center our camera on the player. Now, all that's going to do is make sure that our camera is overlapped with our player at the very beginning of the scene, making sure that they are in the center. And so if we run, we can see that it is in the center. Now, to show you, to make sure that we already kind of put them in the center, but let's move the player over here and run our script one more time. We'll see that no matter where we are, we're panning the camera over to make sure that our player is in the center. Now, if we move, the camera doesn't follow our player. Well, that's because we're only calling this event at the beginning of our scene. We gave it the condition of this is how this works, do this one time, right? If we wanted this to constantly happen, we can add a new event, or if you're already clicking on event, you can press Shift and press D, and it will add it as a child, as something that happens underneath this script. We wouldn't need that there. We can just drag it out and open it, but in some cases, you may need to fast create them, and that's how you do that. One of the things that I like to do before we go any further and I explain how to run something every frame is organization. If you right click on this add a new event, there are some functions that are not available in the normal conditions. So you have to click the button like this for each object. So for loops, for event groupings, for comments and things like that, we do have to add and click on this button. So you might not know it's there, but this is how you do it. If you click on event group, it adds not a comment, but it adds a folder, if you will, to your code script that allows you to stay organized. So we can say at the start of our game, we want to run this code. Now, right underneath it, right, we already have the code there, but if we add it as a child and drop it in, anything that's in here, we can hide away. So as we're developing our game, you may want to organize in that way, and I recommend you do this from the very beginning so you avoid things like spaghetti code. So these would run at the same time if it doesn't matter if they're here or in here. Now, if I add an event underneath this, this would be a child of this, and these would be conditions that you can add under this. And I'll explain a little bit more about how that works, but for now, we're going to keep them organized. So again, to reiterate, and if we right click and we add an event group, this is simply a folder tab, a way for us to identify maybe a group of code. So we could say, for example, idle logic, and we would put all of our game's idle logic in here. And right now we can't hide what's underneath that. We have to first add it into the idle logic, and then we can hide that folder or hide that section. You can't do this with comments. And so a comment really should be only used for explaining what you're doing in your code or leaving a note for yourself rather than organizing your code. So this is one way to organize your code. Another way that you should know is that, like we said before with the external events, we can name this, let's say logic, player idle logic, whatever you want to name it, doesn't matter. We can right click here and we can go add, and we want to add an external event, add link external events. And then we click on this and we can click on the player idle logic that we just created and click the go to sign. It's asking us what scene we want to bind it with, like we talked about earlier. We want to bind the game scene. Click choose. Now, whenever we start our game, not even at the beginning of the scene, it will just include this logic all the time. If you only wanted to run the code in here one time, we could add it to at the beginning of the scene, but then we might do that for like an initialization script, but otherwise we want it to run every single frame. And so we add it without any conditions. We just say import that logic all the time. And then now we can add whatever logic we want to the script. I can add another at the beginning of the scene. I can add another whatever I want. And it functions at the same time as all of this because we include it every frame. So as we develop our game and we need more organization, we might break it down in this way. And that method of development is, with some added features, is the backbone of how we build finite state machines, which I'll be making a video on how to do those inside of GDevelop at a later time. But for now, we can just disable this code, and to do that, you click on it wherever the topmost point is or wherever you want to disable it, and we'll do it at the logic, and we'll press D, and it'll strike it out. D again will bring it back in, D will strike it out. And so this says, don't run this code. So we can have whatever demo code or trial and error code that we want underneath this, or maybe a feature that isn't implemented into our game yet, and just comment it out, and it'll ignore it completely. So going back to the beginning of our scene, we want to create, so now clicking at the start of our game up here, Shift D, will now create a script underneath this event, but not underneath the child, not like we did before. This will create it. This runs at the same priority as this. But where you put your code also matters. Anything above this will technically run first. So just like in normal coding and programming, we want to consider how we need to run our code. Sometimes it's arbitrary and it doesn't matter, but in other times it is really important. So how do we get our camera to follow our player every single scene, every single frame, no matter what happens? Well, we want to run that code indefinitely. We want it to continuously run. And to do that, we don't add a condition. We just add an action. So we can grab this by left-clicking it and dragging it into this new section. And now every single frame, the camera will follow our player. And so now we get this effect where the camera is on our player no matter where we go. And that'll be good for our platformer, but we still have a visual problem. Our game looks super small. And how do we fix that? Well, by doing some math and exploring what we like in the feel of our game. At the beginning of the scene, we're going to do another camera feature. So going into actions, other actions, going down to our camera and layout features, we want to apply a camera zoom. And now, just like before, we'll go to the 0 camera, the base camera, and we want to start magnifying our zoom. I want you to think about this as dividing your screen instead of zooming, in terms of if you're trying to find the math for your game, we can open a calculator and we can take the 720 and we can divide it by 2. So this brings us down to 360 pixels in a XY format. So in the 1080 by 720, so in the 720 height, it now becomes 360 in height. And we can continue to devise this down. And traditionally, it's about a division of 4 times, so a zoom of 3 or 4 times to get down to the 180 format. So when I say 320 by 180 is the best format for a 19 or a 16 by 9 format, that is because if you divide it by 4, and also we'll go to the 1280, there we go, my brain, and we divide that by 4, 320. So we can achieve the same resolution by simply zooming in 4 times. And this would make it pixel perfect for the same scale of our game and the art of our game. And this has to do with correct canvas sizing for professional reasons and other things like that. I urge you to consider this, but as a new developer, it might not be necessary to consider all of those factors, but I think it will weigh into the the overall feel of your game if you consider these factors from the very beginning. Keep your resolution at a full rounding of this value, whether it's ×2, ×3, ×4, ×6, or 8. And that's how we get up to 4K resolutions. It's the only way for us to natively do that. So we're talking about native resolution. Celeste begins at this resolution. Other games use the same canvas size of 1280 by 720 and have different zoom scales. So it really kind of depends on how close you want the game and how big your character is compared to the rest of the game environment. Roughly 10 to 14% is the average of character height to screen height. And that's more philosophy of pixel art stuff that I'll cover in an art video later on. But for now, that's all you really need to know. So at a camera zoom of 4 and zoomed on this player, we now get that crisp, perfect game feel for the actual resolution that we want. Now, centering the player may not be exactly what we want the camera to do. Maybe we want to move it to the player's position with more X and Y axis. Maybe we want to pull the camera a little bit taller than the player and maybe follow from a point up here. We could add a point and center, like I showed you before. We could add a point to our player and put it way up here and then center the camera to it. That's not a great way to do it. We want to then instead probably, instead of using the camera center feature, we would probably want to use the camera XY position and set it to, let's say, the value of the player. So this is where coding comes in. We can access our value in here by clicking on objects, right? And then we can check the things that we want to check for the various things that we're doing. And this allows us to access the expressions, if you will, but we can also type in here. And we can type the object that we want, which is the player, dot, what do we want from the player? We can scale the player, we can do a bunch of things, but what we want is the X value, which is a capital, and we need to follow it up with closing the value. So, because we can pass information into this, but for X alone, we don't. So we say, hey, I want to move the always equal to the player's X value. So the camera will match the left and right of the player perfectly. So they will remain in, the player will remain in the center. Now, if we remove this, we can't press D here. It will not work to just comment this one out. It needs to be an entire logic event to comment it out. So in this case, we're just going to move it up and say at the beginning of the scene, center it on the player. But every frame after we center it on the player, we want to change the X and Y position. So what I did there was I copied this over, Control C, and then Control V to paste it. Or you can right click, copy and paste. Another way is you can copy it however you want. And then when you highlight over the action, you can paste actions as well. And this is really important. If we copy multiple things with Control C, we can paste them all at once to another object. So that might be important for you to know. But now in the Y position, we don't want the player to align to just the X position. We also want to set the Y position and make sure we change that value after copying it over to Y. Now, this will just center the player. It'll do exactly what we just did, and it'll make no difference. So to show that and prove that, we're just going to go ahead and update this. And let me close the previous project just to show you that this is true. And left and right works, and that's it. Excuse me. Let me get a drink of water here. And yeah, sorry about that. And nothing really changed. It doesn't matter how we scale up our game or not. I'm going to go back to the properties and change this back to change the width to fit the screen window and press preview. And now if we increase the size to like full screen, we can see just a little bit more of our game on the left and right. But this isn't working out because the player is in the middle. Okay, I need some more water. My voice is still cracking. Hold on, give me a second. All right, so now that we have this feature built in, the next thing that we want to do is change the Y position. Now, it is important for you to know that that the negative value is either to the left of the X or negative Y is above the Y. Innately, you might think that adding to the Y would go up. It's in fact the opposite in GDevelop. So we're going to do Y on a -16 because we're on a 16 by 16 scale. And actually, we're going to do it times 2. So basically, what we're saying is negative the grid size, which is 16, times 2. But in this case, we're just going to do 32. And so when we do this and we play it now the camera follows our player at a much different perspective, and it lowers our game field down. So you can customize this and choose maybe 16 is more in the style of your game. And now we can see that the player is up just a little bit further, one whole square up. And I would say that this is probably, so now that we're zoomed in by 4, we're at the resolution of 320 by 180. We've obtained that by simply zooming in. So you could just set your project to this and then not need to work with the camera zoom at all. But that's just one way of doing the camera, and there's a lot more that you can do. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, how do I change my controls to be what I want them to be? And so we're just going to add a new event, and we're going to check the condition, and we can type key. So key, or going to the event type, going to keyboard, we can look for a key pressed as a text expression, which I've covered in other videos, and I'll go into a more in-depth how to use GDevelop in the next video that I talk about. But we can set those global variables that are like keyboard key equals A, B, C, D, or WASD. And we can tell it if we press one of those keys. Another way to do that without all that extra work is by saying key pressed, and we get to select what key. And if we add controller support, we can also we can use controller keys here as well. And so we can look through all of the different buttons, and we're gonna bind the A key first to moving to the left, and then the D key to move to the right. So now, if the key is pressed, what do we want to do? Well, if the key is pressed, which means it's continuously held down and is not released, we can say on release, stop doing something. But in this particular case, if A is pressed, we want to simulate. So we click on the player. Now the action is in object behavior. So we want the player to do something. We click the player, and then we can look for what is called simulate control. So simulating control is, remember how we have those default keys? Well, in GDevelop, we can change the default controls to simulate doing the same thing by pressing a different key. So now we can do left key, right key, or any key simulation. And because our key is what we want to do in the game is move left, it's already bound to the left press key. So we're just going to click simulate the left press button. And so if we copy this from over here, we can see that we selected everything. Copy, paste. We paste the exact same thing. We click on the A key here, or we can double click and then say, let's say D is our next key. Capitals do matter here. They need to be lowercase. In this particular, for keyboards, they need to be lower. If we were accessing a controller key, it would be a capital letter, like a capital Y, a capital X, a capital B, a capital A. But we don't have the controller extension added, so it wouldn't actually work right now. And then we don't want the left button to be pressed. We can change that by double clicking and then going down to key right press, or we simply could have added the action and go back through the process. Now, if you don't click on the player first and you go to other actions, let's say you forgot to click on the player and you go to the keyboard. Hello. Oh, we wouldn't get the option, but if you searched key instead of clicking on your player, you could click left press, and then it'll ask you what object you want to be bound to. And normally it says that this behavior isn't, oh, this is for the top-down movement. This is really important. So this is left key for top-down. We would want left key for platformer behavior. And so if we search something, we need to know what we're doing, or we're going to get mixed up here. So I highly suggest for now, while you're learning, to just click the object that you want to work with. There are other ways of accessing it, but this is the right thing to do. So now we press preview. And now if I press A, we move to the left direction. If I press right, we move to the right direction. Now this is interesting because you would think that you would have to continue, that this would make you infinitely move, continuously forever. But because of the key press, it requires you to be holding the key and continuously do this. Now, if we added the trigger once, so we can say once, oops, and this is an event to trigger once while being true, so only do this one time. And I'm just going to press the A key for this, and we're not going to bind the D key. So now we can press play, and if I hit the A key, as you see, it moves us over 1 pixel. And even if I hold it down, it won't work because it's saying run this code one time every time this key is pressed, and only do it for 1 frame. So do it, initialize it one time, 1 frame, that's it. So for us, it's 1 pixel of movement. And if we press the D key, we would go to the right with no problem. But again, A key, we have to tap. Because we did not, in our behavior, remove the default controls, like click the button, we can still use our arrow keys. And I can show you that if I go left on the arrow key, it continuously functions. But if I press the A key, we end up in this dilemma. So if that happens to you, just remember, you don't need to trigger that one time for the simulation to continuously run. This will trigger every frame that we're holding the key down. And it'll stop working when we release it. But maybe in some games, there might be a reason for you to hold down a button for a specific amount of time. Or maybe you need to initialize something to continuously go and rather than not. So what we can do is by moving our structure, as you can see here, even when this key is pressed, right? Now that we've changed the child, it still does the same thing, because without the trigger, it won't do that slow 1 pixel movement, because we move the do once trigger. But whether it's below it in this or not, this feature, the whatever comes first as the condition, controls and dictates the entire flow of everything that'll be inside of that event script. So if we move this over and we change the key to pressed to keyboard, like any key touched, or some other expressions, we can make it so that it like, let's say if we did a key is pressed, we could add a player variable. So I'm going to show you how to use variables now, and then that, I believe, will conclude the basic features of how to use GDevelop. So we're going to click create, and we just want to make sure we drag it out. And now when we press the A key, we want to add we want to change a Boolean or a true or false. We want to make a true or false statement true. So we can do this in multiple ways, and I want to show you the advanced way to do it, and then the way you should do it. So the advanced way is by clicking the action, going to the player, and saying that this is a behavior. So we scroll down, or a variable change. We scroll down, and we can see the variables here. This is a Boolean variable. So rather than toggling it, we're just going to change it, and we're going to call it. So now if I click the variable, I can name it whatever I want, and GDevelop will register it as a variable of being true and false. However, we're not predefining it as being false, so it's called declaring a variable. You may know this already based on your other experience with programming, but there are ways kind of around it. Like if I set a text right here, then we wouldn't need to predefine it. But in Boolean specifically, I'll explain how that works here. So we're just going to assume that we're going to make this true, and we're going to type that the Boolean variable is going to be called move left. And now that's it. We're gonna say that's true. Okay. So when we press A and the variable is, and we're gonna set the move left of the player to true, the player's variable. This is not a scene variable or a global variable. This is a variable tied to the player specifically. Now, we can access this later on and say if the player, rather than selecting the player like we did here, if we were using a text expression, I could say, if I type Boolean, right, we can see that in this action list, we can access a objects Boolean, a variable Boolean, or a few other types of Booleans. And if we click on the object variable of the player, we can then type in what we want. Now, if this was a different type of variable, say a scene variable, and we want to change it, we may do player dot whatever value we want. So player dot move left, right, is true. And that's kind of how we access the later features of our player and the things that we build upon. But for now, right, in the simplest form, we're doing this. So now we can go to our conditions and say if the player, right, scroll down and say if the Boolean variable of, well, we don't have it in the dropdown, right? And that's because we didn't define it. So if we do click in the dropdown and it's not defined, we can add or edit it right here. And it will then become clickable. So I want to show you, right, why we add variables. So you can click this and it will go automatically to the variable section for the object for the player. But there's another way to access this. And so we're going to type move left because we know that that's what it's called. It's really important that the text here is exactly the same as what we just wrote. So making sure that the capitals are exactly the same. And that is the advanced way to do this. And we want to say if it is true, simulate left pressing. So Now, if I press left, we're going to continuously move left forever because the condition is if we've set this to true, continuously move. Now, this would be good for like a infinite runner where we say, well, we're just going to set the player to always be running. So we can say we would, no key needs to be pressed, just simulate the right movement forever, pressing the space bar to jump. That would be a very easy way of developing a infinite runner with very minimal code. However, in this case, it doesn't really work for platformers because, well, we want the A to be only moving when we press it. But now here, to address the Boolean and variables conversation, we're going to go back to our player, we're going to open it up, and then we're going to go to variables. And now when we add a variable, because we've defined it in the engine already, it says that there are variables in use in the events that are not declared in this list. So what we want to do is call this move left, set the string value to a Boolean, and we're going to set it to false, so it's not true in the beginning, or it would immediately activate. Now, if we wanted this to be an infinite runner, we could just set this to true, and then while true, constantly run. Maybe we don't run in the runner when we die or when other things happen, so we can use a condition to decide when this event is triggered. And so now, if we go back to our game event, and I click in the move list, so we're going to go back into here, you'll see now that since we defined the variable, only defined variables added to an object are available in the drop-down menu. So if you don't have it available in the drop-down menu, it's because you didn't add it or declare it. And this is true for every type of variable. And the ones that do work, so now if we go back to our player and go back to our variable, because we added it, we can see that no longer is it saying that we haven't declared it. So if you accidentally did that, there's a really handy tool in here that tells you when you do something like that to correct that behavior. You can do it that way. It's just, it reduces the readability of your code. And whenever you're working on a project, it's a good idea to practice healthy development behaviors and to treat yourself kindly in this process. And so I recommend you definitely work towards having readable code, comment it, because you may leave for a while and want to come back, and all that hard work that you put in, you might not remember exactly what it took to do that. And if you don't leave comments for yourself, in the long run, you may end up with spaghetti code and also multiple iterations of the same thing. So to avoid that, declare your variables, clean up your project, and work in that way. So the last thing so in this department, we don't need this anymore. We could comment that out, and we can delete this and just move that simulation of the player up one. And so here we can still see that although this is a Boolean variable that we have, we just commented it out, and we could delete it. It doesn't do anything, but we might want to save that code, and maybe we could, instead of moving it out, we copy and paste it. So that way we could disable this later if we wanted to and enable that. But that's how we would do that. So now we want to go just to the simulation of left and right. And now this would be the exact same thing if you wanted to use jump keys and everything else. There's logic here for when the player is touching the ground, right? So when the player can jump, when the player is falling, is on the floor. These are states for your character. And you can use these to trigger certain events, like if I'm on the floor and I'm pressing left or right, change the player's animation to walking, or change the player's animation to idle, and those are the ways to do that. I highly recommend you learn about finite state machines, specifically in a platformer and in a top-down action sense. Platformers are a little bit more forgivable if you're not building a Metroidvania, but I highly recommend if you're doing a Metroidvania, or you want to do one, or you want to do any advanced programming, check out my next video, which will be about finite state machines. So if you're watching this right now, it's not out yet, but it will be soon. And I'll be deep diving how to build finite state machines in GDevelop, how to go through that process, and yeah. So right now, one of the last things that I want to introduce you to is that you may not have, or you may want to add another behavior. So as you add behaviors to your character, and we added the health behavior, we now need to add that. Now that we added that extension to the game, we need to add it to the object we want to have health. And so we're going to start our player with, say, 1 HP. Let's say if you get hit one time, you die. And like Mario before he eats a mushroom. And we want the max life to also be 1. We don't need to use any of these advanced features. This is more for armor and regeneration and maybe a shooter game, or a game where when you're not in combat you heal over time or something like that, or you can get power-ups that reduce the damage that you take, like even a Mario mushroom. Maybe when you have armor you're bigger, and when you have no armor and you get hit you're dead. And those are all things that we can establish here, but the important thing is establishing the condition of I have 1 HP. And because we added this behavior, it adds actions and conditions to our accessibility into our condition pages. And so now when we click the player, we can see that we've added the health configuration thing. And so we can see if the player is dead, do something, right? And so when the player is damaged, for example, maybe flash the player a couple of times to show them that they've been injured, or do something special. And we can and this behavior extension adds in all of these features for you, so you don't have to program them at all other than adding a few conditions. So if the player is dead, for example, we can initialize when the player is dead. We want the player to we're going to do delete the object. When the player is dead, delete the player. And we can copy this and paste it. And if we wanted to do something else, say when the player isn't dead specifically, we can do something called an inverse. We're inversing a condition. You may have seen it in some of the other things I clicked on. You can double click this and click inverse condition, which means is not true. So the first one is true, and the other one means inverted is not true. And all it looks like is it has this little red arrow, and this is the inverse of whatever you're trying to do. So I could say, if the A key is not being pressed, simulate moving to the left. Well, that wouldn't make sense because we want it to do that, right? But in this case, or we can say if it's been released or not released. If it's not released means it's being pressed. There's a variety of ways to go about expressing what you want to do, so I'll leave it up to you on how you design that and use it in your systems. But effectively, you can inverse or press, if you highlight it, press J to inverse your tool or the condition that you're using. Now, this doesn't work in actions. This is solely a condition-based thing. So when at not the beginning of the scene means don't render this at the beginning, but render it any other time. Well, why would we do that when we could just remove it, right? So that's a very realistic example of when you might want to do something and when you don't need to. And in this, we can run multiple conditions when we're dead if we wanted to, but that's disorganized, so we're going to delete that. And so when the player is dead, right, die. Well, okay, what are we going to do, and how are we going to add in the elements to function in our game? So what I want to do now is add a new sprite, and we're going to call this enemy. We're going to create the enemy, and the enemy can be anything you want, but in our development case, we're going to make it, normally I would do red, but we're already using red for the platform collision. So we're going to add the new sprite. Hello? Did that not save? We're going to do that again. Let's go into here, paste that, and I do know that I need to resize this. It got doubled up, so we're going to do 16 by 16 and resize. Save this. There it is. It was just taking a second. And now that we've done that, we can drag our enemy in. Now, innately, our enemy is not going to go anywhere. So if I press preview, the enemy does nothing. It has no AI, it doesn't know what to do. So we need to add some behavior to it. So the behavior that we want to add first is we want to make it a platforming character. And we're going to disable the default controls. And this doesn't really matter right now, but at the moment, we don't want to control this at all. So we have to disable the default controls, because if we press the arrow key, it will then move all objects that are bound as a platformer object. But we do want this character to function as though it's standing on this platform. So then we press the render button, the preview button. Now we can see that it acts as though we do on the platform. So at the moment, it doesn't do anything. That's fine. If this is an enemy, we want it to maybe follow our player or something like that. And we can say, you know, if this is on the floor, move in the X direction towards the player. So the X and Y is left and right. Less than the player would be behind the player. More than the player would be on the right. So so in the conditions, if you can figure this out, this is a coding challenge. I want you to say, if the player, or rather, if the enemy is to the right of the player, move to the left. If the enemy is to the left of the player, move to the right. And if you can do that, you use a single condition to check those variables. And I'll let you try to figure that out. And then I'll also explain how to do it. But first, while you maybe take the time to do that, if you're following along right now, or if, you know, in the video, watching it live or later, I want you to still be able to do this. So that's a coding challenge. We're going to stop there on that comment for now. And I actually want you to, while considering that, and when you're done, to go back into your player, go to the behaviors, and I want you to open up your project platforming object, which you can click on the arrow if it's condensed, and also disable default controls. So now, with what we did, only left and right will function. So what we're going to do is very easily add in a condition that if the enemy is in collision with the player, kill the player. Do 1 damage to the player. So what we're going to do is go to our game scene. We're going to add a new condition. And I want to just, again, for coding intention and practices, you can write enemy logic as a coding, as a group. And then inside of that group, we can, remember, click Shift D to add in our new condition. And we're going to say if the enemy is in collision, so we can type collision here, or we can just press C and it'll pull up, or we can go through the options and go to collision, and here we go, right? So if we are in collision with the player, and we're going to say no to this overlapping or touching each other on the edges, we don't, but are not overlap. We want it to entirely just be true. So if we touch it at all, do something. So if the enemy is in collision with the player, then the player needs to be damaged. So apply damage to an object. How many points of damage? 1. We have no armor in our game, so we can say no to these, or you can leave them on as yes. It doesn't affect this right now because we didn't add any armor or anything like that to our player already. So we're going to do 1 point of damage, and we're going to say okay. So now what's going to happen in our game is we're going to walk towards this thing, and as soon as we touch it, it's going to delete our character. Why? Because the game knows that when our health reaches 0, we are in the dead state. And there we go. Everything, that's gone. There's nothing left. Everything got deleted. And we want to run this condition once. Actually, this is a sloppy code. When we are dead, we don't want to delete the player infinitely. We only need to delete the player a single time. So apply 1 point of damage to the player, and the camera can no longer center on the player, and this no longer exists. So what do? We're going to remove the XY and just go back to centering on the player. And when we die, the camera won't snap to a position where the player doesn't exist anymore, and everything won't disappear like that. It'll just pause the game right here. Now, that helps you when you're dead, but you may want to be able to reload your game without closing it and restarting it constantly. So we're going to go back to this example where we press a key. And again, we're going to copy and paste this. And we're going to say that if we press the R key on our keyboard, rather than simulating a direction to the right, we want to load. And we want to load in a scene. And actually, sorry, it's not called load. It is called, where are you at? I think it's import. Oh, no. Scene. We're just going to type scene. There we go. Change the scene. Sorry, change the scene is what you're looking for. So click change the scene, and we can choose the game scene. But effectively, all we're saying is, oh, go back to this game scene. Go back to this page. You want to stop or any other pause scenes? Say yes. In this case, we just want to delete whatever previous scene we were on. We don't need to save anything. Other times you can just say no. It doesn't really matter. And in this case, we're just going to say sure. Why not? And when this is pressed, we only want to do this one time. So rather than searching for it, we can just copy and paste it. Do this one time. So here we are. And if we press the R key, you can see that we respawn. If I hold it, we're respawning constantly. And if I die, I can press R again, and we can respawn from where we currently were. So now space button doesn't work because in the disabled keys, we didn't bind the space key. So here's another challenge for you. Make your character jump. Using the same logic that we just did, make it so that your player can jump. And that way you can avoid this evil yellow square. And then the last thing that I want to introduce you to is a technique that will level up your development experience. Say you want to share this program with somebody else, but you don't want them to be able to press the R key, for example. So if we don't want them to develop using the R key, what we want to do is we add a new condition, and we type editor. And here, or preview, sorry, we're looking for specifically this, is the game running as a preview? So we'll just type preview, and we can say yes. So the condition now is, if the game is being previewed and the R key is being pressed, trigger this one time. And so what I want to do is press Shift D and clean this up a little bit so you can see it in a way that maybe makes a little bit more sense. So we'll follow the logic here. So we're going to move this down to the very bottom. It's not in the enemy logic. It's not in the idle logic. And now what we can do actually is delete this event script, and we're going to call this player keys. And so we're going to uncomment it, so D again, to make sure that there's not a line through it. We're going to drag each of these underneath to keep it organized. Now we can hide that if we want to. And honestly, I kind of like adding this up to the top, not necessarily in the start of the game scene, maybe even before that. And this is developer only, so you may want to add a group and call it dev or debug modes, debug scripts. Sure, debug scripts. And so we're going to open this and drag this inside. And now this is just one feature from our development. And this says if the game is being previewed in the editor, which means you are clicking this particular button, which if they're playing the game online through the GDevelop store in the share button, those aren't previews in the editor. So this is solely for the developer to use. So now when we press preview, we can restart. But if I shared this project with you, you wouldn't be able to. So now that that is done, I'm going to show you how to code those challenges. So if you were following along earlier, I asked you to do something, and now I would like to see that come to fruition. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to copy and paste the enemy, and we're just going to delete both of those functions. Honestly, we actually could have just created a new script. It doesn't. We need to start from a blank slate. Sometimes I'll copy something for convenience if it's in the right category, because what we can do is just double click this, and we're already into the selecting of the right things. And it makes it easier for me to just jump to another variable rather than re-adding things. So if that works for you, do it this way. But particularly, we're going to do a number variable, and we're going to use what we call a text expression. So I could add and compare values here, but we want to check something. If the enemy is, in this case, what's the variable? So we want to check the enemy's X position. So if the enemy, if the enemy, oh, this is variable. Wait, no, I'm in the wrong section. Give me a second. there we go. We can use distance. There's a couple different ways that we could have gone about doing this, but distance is the best way. So if the... No. What am I doing? My brain. Sorry. Position. Forget everything I just said to you. Don't ignore that. My brain had a fart. We want to go to the position, and we're just checking the X position. So again, the first coding thing I asked you to do was position the character and move it around. So what we want to do is click on enemy. If the enemy's X position is greater than, so remember what I said before, if we're comparing to the player's position, and we are checking from a player, so we're saying, or from the enemy. So if the enemy is on the right of the player, greater than is to the right, and then we want to check the player here. So player.x. Remember, just like we did before, the player's X location. So if the enemy's X position is greater than the player, then we're going to simulate the left key being pressed because we gave them the platformer behavior, the left key press. So if we are to the right, we need to move to the left, and if we copy and paste this and change this to less than, we can then simulate the other direction, right key. Maybe we only want that to happen when the player is on the floor, or if the enemy is on the floor. And so that way we can avoid some of what's about to happen, but I just wanted to show you that this is a functional way to do that. So we can press preview, and we died immediately because that enemy is ridiculously fast. So going into the behaviors, we can change the movement speed of this object, and we're going to call it max speed is 50. And acceleration and deacceleration should be around the same if you want them to immediately stop and immediately slow down, or like stop and accelerate. But we could simply change this to 10, and as we hold down the key until we get up to a max speed of 50, then we will gradually increase our speed. So we'll start off slow and move faster. Well, within a high acceleration, this just means that we'll reach 50 immediately, and we could literally say 50 by 50. And that's just saying that we reach maximum speed as soon as we can. And now we can see that this cube is following us, and if I can't jump over it because I don't have a jump key. So to do that next step that I put in a coding challenge, Control-C, Control-V, and in this case, it is appropriate to do that because all we're going to do is change this to the space key. Anything that is a special key starts with a capital, and anything that is a regular keyboard key is lowercase. So if you didn't know that, you could write space like that and just press enter, or you can click it from the drop-down menu. And then instead of simulating to the right, we want to simulate a jump key press. If you want W to do the same thing, you could do that. W is jump. Some people like that. And that jump is different than up key. Because up key could be for climbing ladders or other circumstances. And if you keep the default controls on, up key will jump for you, but if you turn them off, jump is the only key that will work for you. So now when space is jump, we'll jump. So now when we can jump, and we jump ridiculously high, but the enemy, and now that it knows that we are, you see that? So now we have a left and right logic for our enemy that will chase us until we die, and when it hits us, we do die, and it doesn't know where to go, so he's now going to just endlessly go until he falls off the map, because we didn't tell him to do anything else. But if we press R, we can restart our game because we're in the preview, and now we have a functional platformer. So I hope that that was educational enough to get you started in GDevelop and show you the ins and outs of the system. There are more advanced features and things that you might want to know about, and if that's the case, comment in the comment section below after the video and let me know what you want to see and how I can go more into depth about the various features. There are layers that we haven't talked about and other things, but I feel like those are kind of self-explanatory, and in time, you'll learn how to use them. So I do hope that this was, again, valuable to you, and I thank you so much for joining me on this adventure. You can check me out normally streaming on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 9 a.m. to roughly 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, sometimes later, sometimes a little earlier if the content makes sense. But I do hope that I see you guys next time, and as always, cheers, and I'll see you then.